Hello everyone, welcome to this BCA Awareness Week webinar and thank you for joining. It's David Davis of Daisy Group here. I'm just going to wait a minute if you don't mind, just to see if we get some more people who turn up a little late onto the call so that we're not starting without them. So please, thank you for your patience. Please let's give it a minute and I'll start very soon. Hello everyone, David Davis here from Daisy Availability Services. Welcome to this BC Awareness Week webinar. Thank you for joining, and also thank you those of you who waited an extra minute then while we were getting more attendees on. So I work for Daisy Availability Services, which is part of the Daisy Group, specifically focused on business and IT resilience and recovery. So today let's talk about IT and the need for collaboration between, excuse me, pardon me, let's talk about IT, the need for collaboration between IT, information security and the wider business. So this is all, of course, in the context of business continuity and resilience, as we're in Business Continuity Awareness Week. So I'm aware that title may seem very broad, but it's in the context of the seminar sessions this week. So if you have any questions, please use the chat facility within our webinar. Rather than trying to call to speak, I'll read them at the end and answer what I can at the time. So I won't open the mic. My apologies if that's frustrating. Really, there's so many of us on the call that we would just be talking over ourselves, so it's best to avoid. I appreciate, no doubt you've been in conference calls where you've had the same experience. So if I don't have any time at the end to answer your question, my apologies in advance for that. Please go ahead and email me. So my email address will be on the final slide. It's david.davies@daisygroup.com. Onto our agenda. So first, I'll introduce myself in a little more detail to explain who I am and my background. I'll then talk about the resilience roles in an organization which have a common purpose but often have a lack of communication between them. So that's what this presentation is really focusing on. And we'll explore some of the risks of failure to communicate between them. And finally, I'll talk about how to bridge the gaps between the roles for a joined-up approach to resilience. And after this, we'll have a question and answer session at the end of our webinar. So who am I? My background. So I work as a consultant for Daisy in the related fields of business continuity management, or BCM, and IT service continuity management, or ITSCM. And when I say IT service continuity management, you may be more familiar with the term IT disaster recovery or IT disaster recovery management. So I've been working in both these fields at the same time on different projects since 2005. Although my experience in IT service continuity goes back to 1997, I had a lot more hair in those days. I've worked in over 100 organizations to deliver continuity projects and programs, and I'm currently working with several organizations to help them enhance their continuity and resilience. And I've worked in many different types of organizations. So if you're familiar with BCM or ITSCM, You'll know that they're applicable to any sector or industry, so the methodologies and the management systems can apply across the board, fitting into the international standard for business continuity, ISO 22301. Okay, so if we move on to roles with a common purpose and the lack of communication between them. Okay, so these four fellas are going to turn up in a lot of our slides. So they're the four individual functions I'll focus on today. So we've got risk management, business continuity management, IT service continuity management, and information security management. There's no significance to the color coding. It's there to help us differentiate between them, and it's consistent throughout the slides. So I've used the word function instead of manager, as depending on the organization, these may be four separate people holding each of these roles as a job, or it could be four entire teams or even four departments. So for example, in a bank, you might well find that there's a whole business continuity department, risk management department of any number of people, like 10s, 20s, up to 100 or so. At the other end of the scale, in terms of size, these four functions may just be part of someone else's role. So for example, information security and IT service continuity may be part of the IT manager's job. Business continuity you quite often see as part of health and safety or part of security as well. So wherever your organization fits on that scale, the principles of this webinar should still be relevant. So you may be a member of one of these functions in your own organization, in which case this presentation is directly relevant to you. But the presentation is still intended to be relevant if you're in another role. So say, for example, you're the IT manager. In that, hopefully it will give you an insight into how these functions may be interacting in your business and how that interaction could be improved on. So broadly speaking, the functions have a common purpose to try and steer the organization clear of threats and recover the organization, but ultimately they don't necessarily work seamlessly and communicate fluently with one another towards a common purpose. So we'll explore some of these reasons, and the first one being how they've got different but related international standards. So your organization may be formally certified to a standard, so that's kind of the top level, if you like, of aligning to a standard would be to have an ISO audit to prove that you've met all of the criteria of the standard and you're actually certified as an organization. You possess an ISO 27001 certificate, for example. So that's kind of an ultimate goal. Many organizations don't get that far. So this presentation, we're talking about all different levels of organization, different levels of maturity. So you may find that your organization instead is aligned with the standard, or is it attempting to align with standards. So you bought a copy of the standard and you're working towards implementing it. Or you may base yourself on good practice. So you're taking elements or key elements of the standard and are trying to work along with that. So the key point I'm making here really is that each function has a separate set of best practice to follow. It's looking at a different set of management system information. So whilst there's commonality between these management systems, for example, we have policies and specific roles and responsibilities in each of these, and the standards also overlap, they are separate standards. And when I say overlap, for example, the business continuity standard talks about performing a risk assessment to really understand your business continuity risks before writing a business continuity strategy. So the BC manager or the person in that function might communicate those risks to risk management, but is there any conversation or dialogue beyond that? Similarly, information security in the ISO standard, there are a few points requiring business continuity to be in place. So it's far more abridged in what it's talking about compared to the BC standard, but it's still there. And equally, that might be boiled down to a very simple conversation between the InfoSec manager demanding to see the BC plan and evidence of testing from the BC manager, rather than there being any real cooperative work and collaborative work going on. Okay. So next, the 4 functions are also likely to have different reporting lines. So I'll be very surprised if all of these 4 functions reported to the same line manager or director in a medium to large sized organization. So this leads to a really fundamental human error, or human factor rather, not error, which is easy to overlook. So each function has different line management, so therefore it's going to have different motivations, different perspectives on what the business needs from them, different priorities about how they do their work and what they need to achieve those. So ultimately, if their PDRs, their personal development reviews, and their job descriptions have different targets and aren't related to one another, then working together isn't a hard target. It becomes, to an extent, a nice to have, or kind of a secondary aim, where not supporting somebody else may affect your role, but you don't have the direct need to work together. So 4 different reporting lines are fine, but the next level up they're reporting to needs to establish those common resilience objectives which all the 4 functions contribute to. Otherwise, ultimately, it is difficult to work together all the time, because they're the other priorities for each of these different functions. So despite all this, surely the functions are all concerned with the risks of the business, and surely that's a good thing. So why aren't they working together? So whether it's IT failure, cyber attack, fire, flood, pandemic, it's all about creating defenses, avoiding those being breached, and trying to avoid impacts and fix it if an incident happens. So surely aren't they all naturally pulling together and on the same page? Well, for a start, the approach to risk that each of these areas take tends to be very much through the lens of its own function. So InfoSec focuses on information security risk, BC on the operational business continuity risks, similarly with IT service continuity. And then risk management has a much broader view of risk. So whilst it should be taking in risk information fed in from those 3 areas, it's got a lot of other risks to look at and focus on. And ultimately, for the risk manager, risks aren't just a bad thing. They may also present opportunities and positive outcomes. So an example of that is when we leave our houses and travel to work. There's a risk involved with the journey, of course. When you travel, something might happen en route to work, but we make that journey because of the rewards of being employed. So there are opportunities in some risks. So a different view on risk again between each of these 4 functions. So whilst we think at first that risk is a subject with common ground across all 4 functions, it's very easy for the functions to focus on themselves and not see the connections with each other, and really needs to be brought together to have a common view of risk. So also in terms of where they face into whether it's IT facing or business facing, information security and IT service continuity often work almost entirely within the IT department, and that can make them very IT focused and only see issues and impacts from an IT point of view. So I'm not talking about reporting lines here. Information security may have a governance reporting line. That's very likely instead of an IT reporting line. However, the majority of information that a company stores and manipulates is almost certainly electronic data. And the focus comes back to IT and working alongside IT people. So risk management and business continuity management are far more generic in their focus and will probably have far more touch points in the business. But the focus and priorities of your stakeholders and the people you work with can then affect your own focus and priorities. So, for example, it's quite common for the IT service continuity function to view IT recovery differently from business continuity, and to have a different understanding on how quickly IT should recover. So it may not have the information from a business impact analysis, which you'd need the business continuity manager to perform, of an understanding of the recovery requirements of the business, including IT. So whether it's information taken from the BC manager or the ITSC manager or function working with BC. So that may well not be the case, or that level of understanding may not exist in an organization. And when we get to the sharp end of risks, so incidents themselves, the functions tend to have a different focus. So risk management is all about identifying threats and trying to prevent threats from materializing into incidents through mitigation and control. So the function may be involved in crisis management team, but that may well be in a role such as calculating the changing risk to the business, perhaps contacting insurers, that sort of thing. It's unlikely to have a recovery-focused role as a function. Information security deals with prevention from an information security point of view. So, for example, preventing cyber attacks, and also concerns itself with response. So, reacting to a cyber attack and limiting the damage. But would probably leave IT recovery and business recovery to BC management and ITSC management, because that's where the specialities lie. So crisis management usually sits with BC, as this would be happening as soon as a major business incident occurs. But then the two different continuity management functions, IT and BC, will focus on what's next, picking up the pieces to recover the business activities and IT services. So it seems it would make sense if the InfoSec plan for cyber breaches tied up with the crisis management plan and the BC plan and the IT recovery plans. And please have a think about this if this is the case in your organization. So I've talked about the different functions and the needs and things that seem to keep them from working together. So there's different but related international standards. There's different reporting lines. They're all concerned with risks to the business, but see it through their own lens. And some of the functions are business facing, some of the functions are IT facing. And some are more focused on prevention or response, and others on recovery. So they're all coming from different angles and lots of different areas. When at first it's very easy to assume that they all do the same thing and work together. So what problems does this present to the organization? What risks? So day-to-day communication and cooperation between these functions can be sporadic. So there are some barriers between them, and they'll probably be driven by the goals of the individual functions. So, for example, BC management needs to report the BC risks to risk management. They've come out of the BIA and BC risk assessment process, so they have to do something with them. So there'll be output to the risk manager. There may not really be much of a conversation with the risk manager on what to do with them. For example, they've kind of ticked the box of handing them over. Equally, information security may want evidence of the BC plan from BC management to help it with achieving ISO 27001 alignment or certification. So again, it might be a tick box approach. There's no real dialogue between the two. They're firing off information or requesting information from each other. So in this example then, there's no shared view on resilience of the business. It's perhaps a more selfish view of needing inputs and outputs from one another. And just because some communication is happening, we have to be mindful that it doesn't guarantee that this is joined up. So the problem with this example is that it may just work fine and raise no concerns during business as usual. But what happens if that is put under stress during a serious incident to the organization. So let's take an example of a serious IT incident. So what if a serious IT incident occurs and really puts to the test the communication between these functions, and really asks the question of how joined up they are in their response and their recovery plans? So if the functions don't have integrated response, integrated recovery plans, which include integrated communications between them, there's a real danger that they'll stay in their corners and only focus on what they know and fix the problem that they can see in front of them rather than the collective problem. So this could have a tremendous impact on the organization, as it needs these functions to pull together to achieve the best possible outcome from the incident. If plans aren't integrated, they can have different definitions of triggers. So a major incident may be one thing to IT service continuity management, maybe another in terms of what's gone wrong and the magnitude of what's caused it to business continuity management. They may have different escalation paths. So IT may be going off in one direction, information security escalating to governments, business continuity escalating somewhere else, and not coming together under a resilience communications framework under the crisis management team. They could have different communication strategies, so they're all firing off different emails, maybe different text systems, even automated text systems, making different phone call cascades, all of which could create confusion and harm the organization's ability to respond and work together. And they may even have different recovery strategies. So business continuity might be relocating staff to another location, expecting IT support, which hasn't been planned and agreed. IT may just go off and expect to recover IT in a certain way and not think about how it needs to get information security back in place when the IT systems are up and running again. Information security may focus on the preventing the cyber attack or the cyber incident, rather than thinking about what happens if the worst happens, what happens next, if we actually do get a breach, what happens next. So you can test this in your organization by running a scenario exercise for your crisis management team with a representative from each of these functions present to speak for their own elements of planning. That in itself may be quite an unfair thing to do in a sense, because you're putting these functions on the spot. So a safer way of doing that between the functions and helping to get the relationship started on the right foot as a relationship of trust, you could do it as a page turn walkthrough with these 4 areas in the room to really understand where the gaps are between their plans, the gaps between their strategies and what they expect to do and how they expect to communicate it to the organization. And that will help to recognize that there's an issue in the first place, and hopefully help you get buy-in to start to bring them together. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have just one plan at the end of it, combined between all 4. What it does mean is the plans that exist will integrate between one another and actually be usable across the board as a resilience planning framework at the end of that planning, rather than being 4 completely separate plans. Okay, so this isn't good in the first place, really. The lack of communications during business as usual, leading to no communications potentially, or lack of really useful communication between the 4 functions during the high pressure of an incident. So this lack of integration has become more important to resolve rather than less important. Certainly, I think it's never been unimportant, but every organization should certainly have a real sense of urgency about this. And I think for 2 reasons. The resilience profile of organizations having changed, and the threat profile to organizations having changed as well. So let me explain. So in terms of change of the resilience profile, so there's a big positive that there's been a great advancement in IT resilience over the last 10 years. So we've got increasing availability and affordability of design, including the cloud, of course, and you've got a focus on resilient design for services, IT services and data centers. And the overall probability of IT equipment failure impacting the business is certainly declining, which is all good news. So why am I sounding like the absolute pessimist, the continuity person raising a concern? So the concern for me, it may sound a bit counterintuitive, but resilience is better than ever. That's fantastic. Now, I've seen that lead to a reduced focus on IT recovery, which is a concern. So it's like there's so much confidence in IT resilience and the prevention of serious IT incidents that perhaps we're taking our eye off the ball with IT recovery. So by IT recovery, I mean, what happens, what do we do if IT resilience fails? However unlikely we may think that is. So by a reduced focus in recovery, I mean things like reduced generations or age of backup data sets. So discipline in terms of how many backups are kept and for how long is changing. They're getting stripped out to an extent. Now, I know organizations continue to archive, so you may have data backups going back many years, but archiving is typically done on a technology which is difficult to recover from, or not difficult, pardon me, slow to recover from, so isn't perhaps a good thing to use in a recovery. Also, archiving is typically a single backup, and then there may be quite some time, maybe 6 months, a year between the next backup. So there could be a real length of time between archives being taken. So I'm talking about really the daily, weekly, monthly backups taken by organizations. And the second point there is the lack of DR testing, perhaps, in terms of testing, moving more towards proving the failover of systems and replication testing, but then not going back to what happens if we need longer term backups and how do we prove that they can recover. So a focus on what would be caused by an immediate failure, I suppose, like a power outage at the data center where the generator doesn't work, and then you're going back to your secondary data center perhaps to rely on its replicas or backups. Sorry, replicas or failover. So it's about your second chance then when resilience fails. Now, I appreciate that if resilience is built up and resilience has a focus, then most of the concerns like fire, flood, power failure, you would just be using a second data center. So the question is, you may be asking, why is this a concern? Why am I talking about backups at all? So for me, the threat profile has changed, and we all know how it's changed, but we just need to think about it in this context. So the change to the threat profile is IT incidents caused by cyber attacks, which is a game changer, really, because whilst you may have an environment which has a second data center, so in terms of physical incidents, you're well protected. So you have a complete fire failure in the region of your first data center, then your second data center in another region carries on as before, and your IT services continue. What if all of your current data is infected or corrupted by a cyber breach? So what if you have to go back to backups? And the resilience that you have in place doesn't fix the problem that's presented itself, doesn't fix the cyber attack itself. So what if you have to go back to backups to recover the business? And of course, we all know that cyber attack is far more likely than many other incidents. So the issue there is, of course, it could happen, and cyber breaches could happen. So increasingly, I've seen IT setups where there's a belief maybe that resilience is stopping or preventing incidents from happening. Certainly is, but of course we're talking more about physical incidents in those cases and the impact of physical incidents. So cyber attack is a game changer. It really can happen, and it's a serious incident that needs all of the functions to work together. So of course, in risk management be involved, BC, IT service continuity, and information security, of course. So it makes a business-wide incident far more likely, and the spread of it is difficult to assess. So you need to understand which computers are affected, which devices, what data, which would then, and knowing how long the infection has been, how long ago the infection occurred, would be needed to understand how to assess when the last good backup is that you can recover to, which is an important point. So you're not, the normal reaction of IT failure is we go to the next backup. The real problem with cyber breaches is that you may be concerned that your next backup or your latest backup isn't safe because that may have been affected as well. So it's a whole difficult question of understanding where to go back to and whether those backups exist and are good. Not being prepared, of course, will impact the organisation severely from these kind of things, and a shared understanding and a planning across the functions is needed because it's such a difficult problem to face. So if we talk about what the typical actions are after identifying a cyber attack, so those four functions may well focus on their own areas. So for example, information security will try to avoid a cyber breach. So I'm talking about cyber attack at the moment. So before a breach of your organization's security systems has actually happened, so you're reacting to it. So information security would try and avoid the cyber breach and communicate reports and instructions to the business. Risk management would review the need to contact insurers and regulators, so that everyone else is on hold, really thinking about what might happen next. Business continuity management, considering the impact of business activities and what they need to do to recover them. And IT service continuity management would be preparing, I'd expect, for an ITDR invocation if needed. So if they have to recover the data, what would they need to do? So at this point, you may still see those functions working in isolation. But what happens if a cyber attack becomes a cyber breach? So the functions need to become much more interdependent in that eventuality. So information security and IT service continuity really would need to get their heads together with the IT management team to understand exactly what needs to be isolated or switched off, what data replicas and data backups are actually not infected or not corrupted by the breach. So what's actually usable in terms of data to get the organization back on its feet. Business continuity management needs to share in this understanding to know how IT impacts the business activities. So what activities need to run without IT for the moment? How soon will IT services recover? How out of date will the data be after it's recovered? So they can't bank on it being the last backup. It may be older than that. Risk management needs to understand exactly what's happened and the outlook for recovery to articulate this to the insurers and the regulators. So bear in mind there'll be tremendous pressure from the organisation at this point for quick and effective action, for reports and for results. And those functions need to be working together very well as a well-oiled machine to achieve all of this. So how do we look to do that? How do we look to achieve that success and bridge the gap between those four functions for a resilient approach? So the first thing that they need to do is to talk to each other, to contact each other as functions and build a relationship. So for starters, they could walk through what would happen following a cyber breach to identify just how integrated their plans and communications currently are. So that's an example I used in an earlier slide. I think it's something that if they do it behind closed doors between the functions, then there's no finger pointing, nobody gets accused of anything, and they can all start the relationship from that point of understanding where the gaps are and what they need to do to show a positive story to the business of them working together. So write a terms of reference for resilience, and I'm intentionally using the word resilience rather than the separate terms within the functions, with clear lines of responsibility and handovers. And that would be doing business as usual, so beefing up their business as usual communications and responsibilities to one another, and during incidents themselves. So there's crucial times when time's very short and there's no real opportunity to build new relationships or to work out where the gaps between the plans are. Start a resilience forum to bring those functions together, and make sure you have the sponsorship of the senior management team in doing this, to make sure it's not just a talking shop and that the business gets behind you. So then work in a coordinated way to prevent and recover from incidents, and establish a common understanding of the risks the business faces. So coming back to our picture of risk, and everybody has a different lens, it's partly perhaps mostly the responsibility of the risk manager to make sure that they're actually taking in this view of risk and understand that they need to coordinate the understanding of risk between those different areas. So the second point is to plan with each other. So plan together, establishing a common response with integrated strategies and integrated communications and integrated plans. So the last thing you want, if you're one of those four functions, is to be in an incident and then the senior management team, the exec, realizes that you're all giving different communications, your plans don't add up. Some of you are saying one thing, others are saying another. So that's absolutely the last place you want to be, really, in that situation. And you really don't want to be reduced to finger pointing to each other and criticizing each other. We really want a position where you're actually working together, but know that how to work together by having planned and prepared for it in the first place. So think about the different types of plans they need to put in place. So things like incident prevention, and including cyber attack, how that links into crisis management. So your overall kind of exec level senior management team interpretation of how you're going to respond and manage the incident to the business, how you're going to deal with your stakeholders and the media, are you going to close sites, are you going to close lines of business, that sort of thing. So the overall view of how you're going to continue, and integrated into that, into your crisis management plan, your business continuity plan for people and process recovery, activity recovery then, and IT service recovery, linking up so that the IT services are being delivered within the timeframes that the business expects them, or certainly if they're not able to do that, that the business knows in advance rather than finds out during the incident. So also think about the maintenance of information security, of course, during and after the incident, regardless of whether it's an InfoSec incident, an information security incident or not, because that might just be the next incident you have. Obviously, if you recover IT, but don't put in place then the antivirus and the firewalls and all of the protections that you need, then you may well find that you've just recovered and released an IT environment that is in itself open to attack, or more open than it would normally be. So it's important that when you're releasing the IT services to the business, as the IT service continuity manager, that those services are properly protected by the information security measures that you have in place. And use scenario exercises and tests to validate this integrated resilience plan. So scenario exercises being your desktop walkthroughs, perhaps with PowerPoint or with telephone calls, to use to simulate the communications of an incident. Tests being literally recovering the IT or moving your staff and proving staff that can be relocated. Okay, so use those to validate this integrated resilience plan. Cyber breach being a very good place to start as an exercise to test those areas working together and to prove that the functions have a common understanding, and also to find out where the gaps are and what needs to be fixed. And then share your understanding with the organization. So this is important, so that you don't expand from being a closed shop of 4 different functions to a closed shop of 4 functions working together. It's really important that the organization, from the point of view of everybody in the organization at one level, all the way up to the senior management team and the exec, understanding at a high level how you work together in terms of resilience. So an example of that is things like training and awareness, making sure that's joined up. So for example, new starters aren't getting 4 completely different handouts in the new starter packs talking about 4 different things. It is actually all joined up to look like the same approach to resilience. So we're talking about, in terms of actions, talking to each other, planning with each other, so basically collaborating and working together rather than as silos, and then sharing that understanding with the organization, so that the organization knows what you're thinking to an extent, and understands that you're not silos and that you're working together. And ultimately, it may well be that to achieve that, we need to go back to our earlier point about the reporting lines and line management, changing personal development reviews or role definitions to help make this happen. Because you may find in an organization, some of the functions are really enthusiastic about working this way, others aren't. So it's just important to make sure that the culture is that you're all working together. So what we're looking to achieve out of this is a business resilience team. So that being a super function formed with the 4 functions coming together. So this probably won't exist in a reporting line, and the day jobs will continue to be different most of the time. So it's not a suggestion of an organizational change, but if there is a business crisis or a serious incident, or whatever the terminology we use, for that, all eyes would be on you and expectations would be on you. So if you're all under the scrutiny together in a real incident, then let's prepare for it beforehand. So success isn't just about getting your own function 100% prepared. It's also about preparing with the other functions here. It's in everyone's interest to work well as a team, as your organization's exec may well judge you as a team if things don't go well, and certainly reward you all if things do go well. So now's the time to take action and start working that way if you haven't already. So in conclusion, it may be common in organizations that the functions are relatively isolated, but just because it's common in organizations, it doesn't make it right, or doesn't make it the best way of doing it. As we need to think about how the game changes when a crisis or a serious incident happens. So there's no time to fix things at the time of incident, and there's a danger that you'll be reactive and ineffective even, and that the organization is impacted to an unnecessary extent. So you need to be ready to work together as a super function when you're called on. And at the risk of sounding cheesy, if it's a superhero movie, the incident is the time that you stand up, put your capes on, and fight together as a team and succeed as a team. And after you succeed, you'll have a great story to tell about organization resilience. Okay, thank you very much for listening. We've come to the end of the slideshow, so I'd welcome any questions you'd like to ask. Please use the chat function to type questions, or the question function to type questions, and expect some delay as I read through the questions. I won't open the mic, so apologies for that. I just want to avoid several of us talking over each other at the same time. If I don't have time to answer the question, My apologies in advance for that. Please go ahead and email me. My email details are on the next slide. So let me just show you, I'll show you the next slide so you can see my email details. There we are. Just waiting to see if we have any questions. Excuse me, I'm just taking time to read them. Okay, so I'm just reading a question out. If these teams were working in the same reporting structure, which functional area would they report up to? That's a good question. So if they're in the same reporting structure, so if they're all in the same reporting structure, I think that means into which one will take precedence out of those four. I really think well, it might well depend on their line superiority anyway. One of those roles may be more senior than the others in terms of dotted lines together. I think it's something that would have to be decided on in terms of defining the terms of reference. It may well be that you need to talk to the reporting managers. It's more about, I think, making sure it works really. So it would be different for every organisation. Potentially, but I think the question has to be raised of how does this work? How does this actually work in terms of the functions working together and taking their responsibilities? And I think once you've got that defined right in the terms of reference, and if you've got escalation defined in your terms of reference, then that then makes it easier for you to then go ahead and work effectively. So I hope that answers that question. Please do email me if you feel that I've missed the mark there. I'm just going to go through some other questions. Someone's just asked if the slides will be available afterwards. I understand that they will. I think the BCI will be publishing all slides, so all of the presentations this week, if I understand right, will be available to us all. I'm certainly looking forward to checking out one or two myself. I'll just go back to the questions, excuse me. The next question is about looking at smaller organisations where you might just have one person or one or two people who are carrying out these roles and avoiding putting too much pressure on them. I think it's a really good question, because ultimately, I mean, even in roles with lots of people, in organisations with a lot of BC managers, you may well find that there's a lot of work placed on them. It's quite often a heavy workload in these areas. So I think the key thing is trying to set the bar to make sure that your plans actually work and that they are usable and they're up to date. and that your arrangements work. So if that means making simpler plans and having simpler relationships between those areas, I think that's more important. Ultimately, it's got to work when the incident happens. But I'd say, as well as that, if you're working in an organisation and feel that you don't have the time to devote to the area, and you feel that that's sort of pegging you back, that's a disadvantage. I think the important thing there is always to escalate that to your own line manager so that they're aware, because they then have the decision to make about whether they'll look for extra resource. That puts you in a better position if you don't ask them and then there's an incident and you're in a situation where things are missing or things are behind. So yeah, I think, but it is tough. Yeah, that's a good question. I'll just check for another question. We've got a few minutes left. Next question I'm reading is, would you say there's one key piece of information that needs to be shared between the 4 groups? That's tough. And I think it's, yeah, because we're boiling it down to what's the one key thing. I think a common understanding of risk is really important. What's going to happen to the organisation, and a common understanding of what happens at recovery. I'm afraid I'm probably expanding on the idea of one key piece of information in that. Yeah, so it comes back to the idea of stress testing it through an exercise and understanding that does it actually fit together. Yeah, so I think it's probably more than, I'd say more than one key thing. It is those things. Most important though, I think, is the recovery plan and understanding that works together. Because in testing that lots of other things might get shaken out when you give that a shake, if you like, and lots of things may drop out and you realise they need to be fixed. Okay, let me just go back to the question. Okay, there's a question about what's the best way to influence a project solution design towards instilling failure mitigation into the solution. Now, in terms of my experience of projects, it's the tough thing. I know it happens. It's quite a common thing for projects to not necessarily take on the BC or the DR element of project planning, and all can say that they're going to do it in phase 2, and then phase 2 might not actually happen. So there are projects. Obviously, the focus for a project team is getting the project done and getting it out in a certain date, and that can then work against the business continuity principles of doing things slowly, making sure you've understood everything. Because in effect, they're in opposition to an extent. So I think the really important thing there is to make sure that there's within the project gates and within the project framework, that business continuity planning and IT continuity and your risk management and InfoSec are included in the project gates and the project go no go, to make sure that you are putting, say for example, if it's an IT system, that you are putting the arrangements in place to recover it, you're putting the plans in place to recover it, and that you're testing it as part of project release, rather than being seen as something that you do down the line, because it's very easily something that's going to fall off and not actually happen at that point. And it's important then that that's written into the actual success of the project. It's not just an add-on that may or may not be done. And let's face it, if the project team don't have to do it, then they may well just not do it because they'll have other things to focus on. So I hope that helps with that question. Just check for next question. Okay, thank you all very much for those questions. Now, the list of questions, I do believe that I've gone through all the questions. My apologies if I haven't answered your question. The viewer is a little bit difficult to read the questions in, probably to do with user error. I'm sorry for that. But I do hope that it's been a good presentation for you, a good use of your time, and that you feel that you've got some ideas to go back to your own organisations with and make some positive changes for the good of your organisation. Thank you very much for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day. I shall now close the call. Thank you. Goodbye.